me of a story a colleague of mine told me one time at a conference, and we were talking, for some reason we were talking about retirement, and she said, yeah, I had a colleague, this was at the University of Chicago, who retired a few years before I did, and I saw him at a meeting, and I said, how's it going? They moved south. Who wouldn't if you lived in Hyde Park for most of your career? And how's the weather? The weather's great. Weather's great. And you're making new friends? Yeah, I'm making a lot of new friends. And then he paused for a minute and he said, but you know, it's really hard to make old friends. And so with the company of old friends today, I want to, first of all, thank the Heilbronn Fund, which made it possible for me to spend a month in London working at the British Library, which is a very magical space and to work with some of their collections. I'll show you an example in a moment. I think the Emeritus College is really quite a remarkable institution, and I've been here long enough to watch it emerge from a good idea from my colleague Gene Bianchi to seeing it realized in events like this. This room, these people, a welcoming spirit, all of this is good. I've told my colleagues from other colleges and universities about what's going on, and I get a kind of pushback from them, which I think is motivated by envy on their part. So anyway, it's a sweet deal, and may it live long and prosper. So I want to begin with there we go. I was going the wrong way. This is a painting that I discovered in London. It came into the British Library collection fairly recently. It hasn't appeared on their website, so I felt like I got to the clearing before anyone else. It's a painting from the late or mid to late 18th century, which was a pretty early period in the British East India Company's expansion, particularly into Bengal. And so I want to walk us through the painting and ask you what you see. As we look at this, we see this figure here, which is this is supposed to be a painting of a sati, a Hindu wife who is being immolated together with her husband's body so that they may together go continue on what they have been in their lives together, continue on into the next world, arriving at the same time because they are in some fundamental, let's say, ontological way, they are already not two, but one in this kind of two forms, you might say. And so here's this figure. Whoops, let's go back here. Take me a minute to adjust to the technology. So what we see here is the husband's body. We see the wife sitting up, looking at us with a coconut in one hand and I think a flame in the other. And here in the red, you see these are sepoys. These are East India Company employees, soldiers. And then we have this landscape, what may be a pilgrimage going, the river coming down. And so the question occurred to me is what is going on here? Is this a picture of an immolation of somebody? And yet, if you look at her, you see that she's in fact not being consumed by the fire. She is in the fire, but she is not being cremated by it. And so the question that one might want to ask is, who is that person? What category does she belong to? Does she belong to the category human? In which case, how is she able to resist being consumed by the fire? Or is she in another category, what we might call a goddess? And it's in this tension between what are we facing here, or she is facing us, and what are we to make of this? One of the things that has been characteristic of this tradition is that both in in the Hindu context and in the British context was the assumption that whatever else is going on here, it has something to do with religion. Religion was not a word that was well defined in those days, not that it's any better defined now, but and so the British, some of the Hindu leaders and scholars and pundits and so forth that they talked to about this said, well, this is part of our religion. And the British not wanting to do anything that would disrupt the profitable commerce that they were, as they were slowly, well, maybe not so slowly, draining wealth out of India to create the lavish 18th and 19th century wealth in Britain from the imperial project. So it was a moment for me in the library looking at this. It's quite a large painting, actually. It's about like that. I have the measurement somewhere in my notes, but the British didn't want to interfere, and so over the period from about 1800 to 1830, there was a debate that went on among the British themselves about whether this procedure or this practice should be tolerated. There was a debate among Hindus about whether, where, and if it is in fact part of their tradition, and by whose authority is it counted in or counted out. And so a lot of what I've been working on is trying to tackle those kinds of questions. So welcome to my book. This is where it is at the moment, and I'm going to be focusing on two things. One, this first chapter, which I'm calling Departures rather than Introduction. And I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. And then the second chapter, which is called Stories, is the one that we're going to look at, stories of sati, stories of what happens which is really the core myth that is part of this tradition. And then resemblances, other stories that aren't exactly the same, but have a lot of similar characteristics. And then that's the first part. The second part of the book deals with the politics of sati, you might say, in the 19th century and really on down to contemporary India. But that's a little bit off the grid of what I'm going to be talking about today. But give me your email, and when the book comes out, I'll tell you should rush and get it. But you may have decided long ago that maybe not so much. So when I use the word departure, I think of the content of a book as kind of moving around rather than as being a fixed object. If it doesn't move on the page, at least it moves in our imagination. So I think of what do we do when we depart? We pack up our stuff, our computers, our medications, the names and addresses of people we want to meet, that we might be working with at our destination. And what do we bring to this process of departure? That's non-material, such as the kinds of dimensions that we culturally dwell in, and seeking to understand another culture. What concepts or classifications or categories that make the other recognizable? What are the biases that may make it unrecognizable? What do we bring? What do we leave behind? What did we forget? What did we wish we had when we got there? Where is our point of arrival? What is it that we have found? A curious term, because it probably wasn't lost, at least it wasn't lost to other people, it may have been lost to us. So the space between departing and arriving, for me at least, can at times be murky and confusing. And so what I'll share with you today is the story of that involves Sati and involves her father and her husband, and we'll get to that in just a second. It also strikes me that stories are also all about place. When you think about a story, it happens somewhere. It may have happened somewhere that you were present to when the story was told, or when the events happened that then later created the story. And so certainly in religious traditions, stories are all about places, stories about things that happened in Jerusalem, stories about things that happened in the company of the Buddha, and so forth, stories that happened in particular places. And this is true with the story that we're going to focus on today. And the place that I'll begin, this is, we can kind of skip over this. There's a term that actually, this may be useful for you. There's a kind of term that I've seen emerge as I've been looking around, trying to find a way to think about the process of interpretation as being situated in various moments, or in various relationships. So that all of this, from what our education is, what our occupation, our ethnicity, our religion, our language, family status, the stories that make up who we are part of what locates us where we are. The fancy word for that is positionality, but you don't have to, kind of a clunky word. But I think what we're trying to get at is the sense that we're located, and our location is not fixed or frozen. It's in process. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to name at the beginning of the book, to, in a sense, have the reader pack their bags and come along. The stories that I'm going to focus on today, it is said, according to legend, that it took place here in the North Indian town of Kankal, which is just down the road from Hardwar, very important sacred city in the Hindu tradition, a very old city, certainly already there in the time of the Mahabharata, and probably even earlier than that. So there is already this kind of sense that places and stories belong together. So the linkage between place and this temple, which is a temple to Sati and to her husband Shiva, was a real find for me, because I didn't quite know when I first went looking for places what I would find. Not many tourists come here, and yet it's actually gone under quite a bit of what you would say, upgrading. It looks quite prosperous compared to how it looked when I saw it the first time. And like many Hindu temples, at least, it has a lot of things are going on at once. So we have some commerce going on over here, sale of ritual items, of pamphlets and books, cassettes, and so forth. And then here you see, here's Shiva, and here is Sati. He's carrying her away from the temple, because the events of the story are understood to taken place there. Okay, so I want to say we not only read stories, and they did have pamphlets that summarized the stories. Actually, I found one that was in English, though most of them are in Hindi, and we spent some time trying to translate one of them as a sort of source. This is the story they tell in their using their media. So it seemed to me what would be a good place to start. So this gentleman is known by the nickname Lal Baba. Lal is the word for red, and Baba means sir or father or esteemed one. And I had the good fortune of meeting with him and asked him to tell me the story of what happened there. And so for about a half an hour, he, in this rather kind of droll persona, walked me through the story. And then at the end, he sort of gestured and he said, yes, it all happened right over there. Let's just go on to the story itself. And this, what I will read to you, this is from, this is part of the book, I guess. And it's my sort of summary or paraphrase of the story. So bear with me. I hope it'll all be coherent enough for you. The beginning of the story is it begins, as many stories in the Hindu tradition do, once upon a time or once long ago, the gods Vishnu and Brahma were worried that Shiva was not married. He lived in the mountains all by himself, and Vishnu and Brahma persuaded Shiva to go with them to visit the great goddess. And there she is. There's, well, a couple of forms of her. In this temple, she takes the form of a flame. I'll come back to that later on. And in this one, she takes the form of Durga, which is a particularly venerated form in Calcutta and Bengal. There's a huge festival every year called Durga Puja that if you ever get to India in the fall, you must experience that because it's really extraordinary. And so here she is, and she's slaying this demon who is disrupting the world, and she does so with a kind of tranquility of her face that you might say or frames the actual energy and the violence that is taking place as well. So they persuade Shiva to go to visit the great goddess, who this story is named Uma. She has many other names. And they ask her to take birth and to marry Shiva. And she says that she would meet their request and take birth as with the name of Sati, which means she who is fully present, from the Sanskrit word sat, meaning being. So she is all here, all in, you might say, to take birth as Sati, the daughter of the great king Daksha. But she warned them, and this is an important detail, she warned them if anyone failed to respect her, she would abandon that body of Sati, and she would return to her divine form as Uma. So we're dealing with a narrative that has a lot of fluidity in it. After some time, the arrangements for the wedding ceremony were made, complete, and the two were married and moved to live in Shiva's home on Mount Kailasa, which is the highest mountain in the universe. It's actually a place in Tibet that pilgrims go to. So here's Daksha. He's the sort of bad dude in the story. And he's a king, and he's used to having his way. In most of these stories, villain kings are always depicted as having mustaches. So that's you can kind of tell where they are in the hierarchy by their facial. And at any rate, sometime later, Daksha, and here's Sati, the young girl. And there's another character, there's Shiva. And the fourth character that I'm putting, that I think belongs in the story, in the sense as a character, although you might be surprised, and that is the sacrificial fire. And it plays a very important role in the story. And we might need to say a little bit about what the sacrificial fire means in Vedic and Hindu Brahmanic tradition over the centuries. This is the you might say the source and generation of energy that moves the cosmos, moves the universe along, and it takes the form of heat. Now there's lots of forms of heat, as we know, and here is the god Agni, whose name also means fire, and he is the one who pours the clarified butter into the fire and keeps the cycle of energy going. So it's very important to produce this process, and among some Brahmin communities, the fire must never extinguish. So it's rekindled and carried from place to place and established among the community. So all were invited. Oh, let me go back. Sometime later, Daksha decided to host a great sacrifice at his home in Kankal, the temple that we saw. He invited all the gods, all the kings, all people, and all forms of life in all units of time. Everything that you could imagine, and then the things you couldn't imagine, those were invited also. All were invited except, wait for it, Shiva. Now, when he announced his intention to host the great sacrifice, his priest, named Dadichi, protested that no sacrifice would be effective unless Shiva were included. Daksha answered that once before he had sponsored a sacrifice like this, and Shiva had failed to pay him proper respect when he entered the sacrificial enclosure. Now, we'll back up for a second later and ask, why that was such a pivotal moment. Shiva had failed to pay proper respect, and when he entered the sacrificial enclosure. Besides, Daksha continued, Shiva was a man without kin. He had no caste. He had no family. He had no possessions. He lived on the cremation ground. He drank intoxicants out of the skull of a human head. He was not fit to be included in such an important event as the Great Sacrifice. So there's a tension, obviously, as you can see, between Daksha and his now son-in-law. And we'll come back to reread the story as a cautionary tale about family relations. But for now, these guys are all gods, or maybe Daksha's not a god, but the category of what counts, the spectrum between the human and the divine in the Hindu tradition is very fluid. And so it all depends on where you're talking about, what categories these go in. But certainly Sati is a goddess, as we saw, and Shiva is a god, and Daksha is the father of one and the father-in-law of the other. So the preparations for the sacrifice were continued, and the guests began to make their way across the sky in their chariots. Now that story is told here. So this is a painting from Marwar, which is in the state of Rajasthan. Those of you may know India's geography a little bit. And we see over here is Sati and Shiva having a conversation. And she sees all these people going in their chariots, or their swans in this case, across the sky to where? The sacrifice, the sacrificial enclosure. And Sati wants to go because it is her father, that even though they haven't been invited, she says, well, we're family, we don't need to be invited. And Shiva says, well, I don't really want to go. And so she finally, in various versions of the story, persuades him to, if he's not going to go, then at least she'll go by herself. So that's the moment that this painting is capturing. And so here's the, and now, as often works in Indian miniature paintings, they're actually stories that take place sequentially. So this is, you might say, moment one, and then moment two. Here's Daksha, this time with a beard, as the sponsor of the sacrifice. And she has already had her confrontation with him, which I'll describe in a moment. And there she is in the fire, once again, not being consumed by it, but, and then the whole, here's the Mount Kailasa here, and here's the palace of King Daksha. So that's one of the ways in which locating the story visually on a painting like this is it takes place. So, okay, now let me go back and just, the preparations continued, and Sati saw them as they were going past and asked Shiva where everyone was going. He replied that they were going to Kankal for the great sacrifice, and she told him she wanted to go. He said that they had not been invited and it was not proper to go where you're not invited. She answered rather that since they were family who was hosting the event, they would be members of the family, and so no invitations were needed, as they already said that. But Shiva refused to attend, but he did agree, important point, he did agree that Sati could go if she wanted to, and Shiva sent his companion Nandi, who takes the form of a bull, and a number of servants and people that accompanied her. So she wasn't out there on her own, but she was being. So Sati arrived at Kankal and saw that the seats for each of the gods and members of the family had been set out around the sacrificial fire, and she asked her father why had Shiva been excluded. And Daksha spoke to her abruptly. Your husband, I'm quoting him now, your husband is a filthy beggar. He has no kin. He is a Kapalan. A Kapalan was a community, ascetic community in ancient India. And their descendants are still, you can see them in places like Benares and particularly at big pilgrimage festivals and so forth. And these guys are pretty remarkable and clearly living a very radical ascetic lifestyle. And they are, in a sense, kind of the mirror image of how, kind of proper life in society. They remain beyond reach, as it were, and then occasionally they show up. But they have this kind of dimension in the Hindu narratives of being, in a sense, kind of dangerous characters because they are so antinomian. So he's a radical ascetic. He lives in the cremation ground. He drinks stuff out of a skull. He smokes weed. That's not in the original text, and pretty good weed, I guess. But he insulted, and Shiva says, and Daksha said, he insulted me once before by not paying proper respect to me at a sacrifice once before. He went on to say then that he only agreed to Sati's marriage to Shiva because Brahma, his father, insisted on it. Now, this is an important detail, as we'll see as we come back to the kinship dimensions of this, and that is one of the duties and honors of the father of daughters is to arrange their marriage. And so, since Brahma took that out of his hands, and I think some levels of Daksha resented that, and so in a sense he's sort of acting that out in this episode. So Sati was filled with rage at hearing her father insulting her husband. She's being a good wife. She's protecting and defending her husband. That's what wives are supposed to do. She spoke back angrily at him. She said, I will no longer live in this body I have received from you. With that, her body began to flame up with the fire of her yoga, or what you call yogagni. This is her inner heat. And I think I may have some more pictures for us here. So here's a drawing from the 19th century art school in Calcutta. And here you see, here's Sati here, here's Daksha, now sort of made up to look like some kind of Rajput prince or something. And over here is Shiva, looking a little bit as he sometimes appears. And there's the sacrificial fire. And there's Brahma in the back with 4 heads. And there's Vishnu, the blue one. And so, and all kinds of other guests. And everybody's there except, of course, Shiva. And so the news of Sati's death. Oh, here's one that another one. This is a folk painting from this community of women. So this painting is done by women. So here is Sati over the fire. And here is Shiva. We'll get to this moment in the story with his multiple arms. He's coming in to engage the action. And these are, I think, I take it to be servant women. And here's the sacrificial fire. The news of Sati's death by fire quickly reached Shiva. He was overwhelmed with grief and flew into a rage. He pulled a lock of his hair out from his head and threw it onto the ground, and immediately an enormous figure called Virabhadra sprang up, and Shiva instructed Virabhadra to go to Kankal and to destroy the sacrifice. Quickly, Virabhadra assembled a band of Shiva's retinue and they went to the sacrificial arena. And when they arrived there, they immediately destroyed the sacrifice, scattering the offerings and the utensils and chasing off all the guests. Daksha tried to escape, but Virabhadra grabbed him and tore off Daksha's head and threw the head into the sacrificial fire. High drama here. So here's two representations. The first one is from a very popular comic book series called Amar Chitra Katha, which means our immortal stories. And here she is, in a sense, this happens often in Hindu stories. It happens with Sita in the Ramayana. Also, when she enters the fire, she actually goes into two forms, just as Sati has one form, who is the goddess, Uma, remember, and the other form, which is the daughter of Daksha. So here's Daksha being astonished as her body bursts into flame. And this one is from one of the guidebooks. And here you see, here's the Shiva's community of people. And here she is again being not consumed by the fire, if that makes any sense to us. I think it does at some very profound levels. He picked up her body and wandered off into the mountains, consumed with grief. So there's Virabhadra, kind of one of Shiva's forms, and there's Daksha getting his due. And then that episode generated its own forms of visual representation. One of the more curious ones is actually a snuff box. It's in the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. And on one side is this scene of Sati going into the fire, or over here is this is the same thing, but this is the bottom of it. And these are two of the more exotic forms of religious practice that the colonial British found utterly strange, and in fact made even stranger objects depicting that narrative. And here's another one of this moment. Shiva comes back, he picks up her body and wanders off into the mountains, consumed with grief. And soon the whole world began to collapse. When Shiva's not participating, things don't go well in this, according to this tradition. And so Vishnu and the other gods chased after Shiva. Vishnu took out one of his disc weapons called a chakra. It's a kind of it's a round, it looks like a circular saw blade, and you throw them like a frisbee, and you can cut people's heads off with them if you're really good at it. It's not something you want to do for a living, but at least it's part of the story. So soon the whole world began to collapse, and Vishnu and the other gods went after Shiva. Vishnu took out his discus weapon and threw it at Shiva and Sati, and the discus struck Sati's body, and parts and pieces of it fell to the ground, and as each piece fell to the ground, she was reconstituted as herself, fully reconstituted. At each place, her body was transformed into her whole form. And Shiva took the form of his linga, that is the mark of his presence. It's a conical shaped object, and to remain in each place. And these places are called Shakta Pitas, meaning seats or thrones of power which is gendered as feminine. So here's a painting from a temple, the one where Sati takes the form of fire. And here's, sorry, this is pixelated, but here's Shiva carrying Sati off, and there's the goddess up there. Remember, she's half goddess. And here's the sacrificial fire, and all kinds of mayhem is going on. Here's Brahma, and this may be who that is. Okay, so I will come back now to ask the question, what is going on in this story? If you can help me, please. I've got deadlines. My editor wants a couple of things we need to know about the context of the story that may be useful as we engage it. First, the sacrifice in ancient and post-Vedic culture, as stories were circulating, were part of the ancient practice. We need to know, for example, that marriages were arranged and continue to be arranged in much of India still by the parents for their children. Marriage is not primarily something between the husband and the wife, but the marriage is part of what holds a family, an extended family, together across the generations. And so it's, as one friend in India told me, he says, marriage is far too important to leave it to the kids to decide. There's a lot at stake for everybody. As one said, you know, we don't have divorces in India. We marry and fall in love, and you Westerners, fall in love and then marry, and then you have a 50% divorce rate. So how's that working for you? You know, so, and so it makes sense that that we understand what's involved in the decision to give one's daughter in marriage to. We need to know also that Hindu understandings of marriage include merging of the bride and groom's being, what I call an ontological turn. The wedding ceremony itself is understood as transformative, as sacramental, if you borrow a term from another religious tradition. But there's something transformative that takes place. And this is important because it enables us to see what we might have missed. For example, why does Daksha hate Shiva so much? Daksha says that Shiva is beyond the bounds of civilization, that he's not from around anywhere, he doesn't belong to anyone, and that Daksha was snubbed when Shiva didn't touch his feet when he came to the first sacrifice. Daksha was left out of the wedding plans, and he needed sati for more important. The people who planned the wedding, including Brahma, who was sometimes called the grandfather, but in this case he's Daksha's father in this story. They needed sati for more important things of locating Shiva and to find her and to bond together. That episode in the story then opens up a consideration of the resentment of Daksha and how its toxicity and corrosive power can be at work and in ways that we don't notice. So I'll come back a little bit more to that in a second. Let's see if I've got more pictures for you. Yes. So here's what has emerged over the last couple of hundred years at least. These are some paintings from a place called Kalighat, which is one of the temples in Calcutta that is understood to be part of the body of Sati. It's one of the places that fell. And it's a very important temple. If you ever go to Calcutta, you should go there because it's really quite an extraordinary place. So here's Shiva carrying Sati. You see and here's the sacrificial fire in the background. This one is from the Victoria and Albert collection. This one's from the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And these were all done by artists around the temple in Kalighat. That's how they got the name, Kalighat paintings. And they were painted in a kind of gouache, I think is a kind of like watercolor paint. They were painted very fast, and they were sort of painted, we think, they were sort of painted in a kind of assembly line style. So one person would put the brushwork in on the limbs, and others would put in the details, and they would sell these as souvenirs for pilgrims who came to the temple or people who were, and for a long time, the British at least didn't think they were art. It was just, popular ephemera. It wasn't taken seriously. And then the Kalighat artists were kind of put out of business with the invention of lithography, which then became the way in which a lot of posters and paintings of gods and heroes and ancestors and so forth that form a lot of popular art in India today. So, and here's a much more recent one here. Shiva is the kind of, might say, dressed up and looks a little bit different. And he's very muscular. He's looks more like a film star, maybe. And this one is a continuing folk tradition from the state of Orissa. And there's Shiva looking a little more out there. And here's Sati and the sacrificial fire he's carrying her away. So that's the story and people who would already know the story. It's a very well-known story. People everywhere I ask, what's the story of Daksha's sacrifice? And they say, oh yeah, I know that story. So it's a very well-known story. And here's a much more contemporary one I found on the web as I was preparing this. And so here we have Shiva now in his dark gray, in a sense, living on the other side of the boundaries between life and death. And there's Sati, and then one or two more. Here's a much more contemporary one. Looks like it's right out of a Bollywood film, maybe a horror film. And here we see Shiva is not somebody to be messed with. And finally, a popular television series called Dewan Ke Dev, and there we have Sati now looking much more like a glamorous Bollywood film star, and Shiva with his serpent around and his what do you call it? Moon, the crescent moon. Thank you. I knew I'd get to it eventually, and these beads and various things that those communities often carry or wear. So now, what does this story mean? Or is that even the question that's one that can be answered? There's certainly levels of meaning. There's the religious meaning. Its context, it's about worship and devotion. It's about loyalty. It's a story of gods and goddesses. It has twists and turns. It's intensely strong characters. The fact that the story has been told and retold and danced and sung and drawn and worshipped for centuries suggests that there's something going on there that people who venerate the story and draw meaning from it. There's other levels of meaning we could suggest, some of them having to do with where it's happening, something having to do with what communities do Daksha and Shiva belong to. Daksha seems to be concerned with what it's not a technical term, but it's an untranslatable Sanskrit word, namely dharma, meaning the order of things, how things should be tended to, what arrangements are the right ones to make. And this is not necessarily obvious in any given context. And so dharma requires a kind of engagement. It's not a set of rules and laws, as it's dharma is sometimes translated as law, but it's really much more nuanced and subtle, I think, than that. And then finally, about family relations, and as we said, we can. I'm sorry, I lost my place here. Okay. It's a story about family relations and family tensions. Through this filter, we have a father and a daughter, a father-in-law and a daughter-in-law, a husband and a wife. There may be more ways to explore the story. There may be other meanings that are still yet, at least to me, to be disclosed. In Hindu traditions, marriages involve rearrangements within the husband and wife's relation, and as the two become one, the ceremony involves. It shouldn't surprise us when we think about it. The marriage relation, the wedding relation involves the husband and the wife tied together. His clothing tied to her clothing, and they walk 7 times around the fire. And as that circumambulation goes forward, something is going on, we might say, ontologically. So the nature of reality in that moment is undergoing transformation, and it's irreversible. So you better be ready, and you better pay attention. It's a story about loyalty, obviously Sati's loyalty to her husband, and yet she's caught in the middle between a father who, in a sense, and here's where, forgive me, it gets maybe a little bit psychologically, what does the father of a daughter lose when he gives her away? As a father of a daughter, I remember going through that. Yeah. And fortunately, I think she made a good choice. I was asked for my approval, but I wasn't consulted about whether that is the one she should. That's the difference between how we do it here and maybe how one would, how that process would go forward in a Hindu context. But at any rate, so for some, at least, the story, what's the story about? It's about loyalty. It's about devotion. It's about hanging in there with the people to whom you belong. It's a cautionary tale for Daksha. He's overstepped his bounds. He wants more than his positionality entitles him to. And that may explain why his rage is so intense. That Shiva receives that which Daksha must now release. He has access to as husband and wife, they have access to a reality that the father and father-in-law are denied by the social arrangements of things. And in fact, the violation of the father of the daughter's autonomy, and so in this story, then Sati entering the fire, she actually is ferocious in her strength. So maybe it's one has to rethink the question of whether she is, in a sense, erased in the story. Part of what is involved in the loyalty, particularly since it's we are focused on Sati's loyalty to Shiva, is that she cares for him the way that she would care for God, because the boundaries between him and deity are porous, and so sometimes it says, Hindu women are supposed to treat their husbands as if they were gods, which is really a kind of caricature of what I think is going on there. So the implosion that she displays in entering this fire displays her sacred power and takes the story to the next level. As the goddess arriving on the other side of cremation with a renewed body that is appropriate to the landscape of the new world she's entering. She ends up getting it both ways. She is reborn in one version of the story as the goddess Parvati, and she, in a sense, replays Sati's story, only this time to a happier outcome. Or as in this tradition of her divided body sent out into the number of places where her parts of her body fall, or there's no single opinion about which ones those are, and some claim those status, and some say no, not that place, over here, this place. So now let's see if we can bring this a little bit together. Sort of dancing in the dark up here. So it's a strong story. It's not a story you're likely to forget once you make sense of it. Violence, beheading, resentment, what these days we might call family dysfunction. That was an earlier, his title is Sati's Dysfunctional Family. It's a Shaivite story. It comes out of the tradition of loyalty to Shiva, although it is known across many other communities, those who would identify Vishnu or Krishna or the goddess as their principal deity. The story has an edginess to it. It has roots in the Mahabharata. It's a kind of tough story, an epic story of family at war with itself. I always have the feeling when I'm thinking about the story that there's something, maybe many things, that I'm not seeing. Some important lessons to be learned through much trauma. Everyone ends up where they should be. Daksha lives out his life with the eye, through the eyes of a goat. As we, here's a little bit of the summary of the story in case you forgot the beginning where we were. Sati and Shiva remain fused together, creating an arrangement of dualities that merge, the two becoming one, male and female merging, Sati and Shiva merging, husband and wife, presence and absence. All these things seem to gather in closer. The story is, as the anthropologist or French anthropologist Lévi-Strauss used to say about myths, is that the stories are something to think with. The stories are a way to think about families, to think about marriage, to think about God, to think about standing your ground, in even if it means standing up against the very people you're supposed to be deferential to. So as I've read and reread and thought and rethought what might be coming through from behind, like Hindu statues that come out of the walls, and we don't see what's behind them. We see what they choose to show to us. And so now I want to move kind of beyond the story a little bit, and coming back to our statue here. What is the central iconography of Sati and Shiva? It's him moving. He is not standing still, and he is carrying her. So, and this is the place where it happened. This is where the sacrificial fire, they say, according to tradition, where that took place. And Sati's form is back. You go back there into the back. You can't see it from here. And here is Shiva's presence. This is the linga. It's covered with flowers here, but it's the mark of the object that contains Shiva's presence, and you see people walking past it and taking what they call darshan, seeing it face to face with their own eyes. And there's only one place that has this, and so to go to that place is to do something extraordinary. And then these shrines, that popped up after Sati's body parts were cut up by Vishnu, it turns out they're all over India. So this is, although they're most condensed in this region of Bengal, Bihar, parts of Uttar Pradesh, and then up in this area in the mountains, and then all the way down to the very bottom of the country. There's this one that's in Pakistan, which I'll show you a picture of in a second. So these temples now are understood to be habituations for the presence of the goddess. And this is one that was quite near where we lived for a semester in Missouri in the mountains of North India. And this is the one. This is Jawalmukhi's shrine where she takes the form of a fire. It's a natural. Apparently, there's some kind of what do you call it? Gas in the subsurface of the land that comes up, and so there are several places, and you go in the temple, you see these little bits of fire coming out of the walls, and it's really quite a remarkable experience. And so that just as she became the fire in the story, she now continues to be the fire in this shrine. So it's very well attended. It's really enormous. This is just a little piece of it. Another one is a place called Kamakhya in the state of Assam in the far northeast of India, where and you have to go down a set of stairways, and in fact way down along stairs carved into the rock of this. This is on top of a mountain. least. And there, in the very dimly lit, is what is understood to be that part of her body that marks her as most specifically feminine, namely what in Sanskrit is called the yoni, or the sexual organ. And that temple is particularly sacred to some of these people that would be quite at home with Shiva and hanging out in the edges of things. So these are the ones, at least, that I've been to over the years. And this is the one that's now, it's in Pakistan, in Baluchistan. It is a cave temple, and it's very remote. And given the politics of the region, it's in a kind of complicated space. And then finally, this is a little street shrine in the town of Bhaktapur, and there you see her two breasts are, and so people come and they put the sacred red powder, maybe some flowers, some lamps, and occasionally there'll be a priest who will hang out there for a while, but I couldn't get very much information on, nor could I even though I had a Nepali scholar with me who thought, oh, well, he'll know. And he goes, I have no idea what that is. So, in a way, Sati is everywhere. And so what are we to take away from this story that you don't need to be a Hindu to learn from? It's a story that, while is deeply embedded in the particularities of Hindu culture, of Hindu sensibility, of Hindu aesthetics and Hindu spirituality, there is a sense in which, like all great stories, in a sense it belongs to all of us. It's an invitation to think about the social and familial and relationships that are important in our own formations, even though they may reflect different practices. I think of his story in the way that I think of the story of Oedipus, and what Freud was able to see in that story was only partly about what the Greeks did. It was much more about the complicated and often unnamed and unmarked experiences and sensibilities that we have in the most primary relationships of marriage, of family, of the relationship with gods and goddesses. So the story of Daksha's sacrifice, or maybe is it the story of Sati's self-immolation and becoming the sacrifice? One takeaway for me, at least, is that the story laid out the paths of folly and the paths of loyalty, the paths of courage, and the cautionary tale about the consequences of overreach. Here, Daksha is the center of our attention, a tale about the consequences of loyalty and about finding our way. So stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a simple question. At what chronological point in Hindu history did this story rise up and was first heard or acknowledged or appeared?
Right. The famous Indian scholar A.K. Ramanujan once said about the Ramayana that nobody had ever heard the Ramayana for the first time. And I'm not trying to evade your question. I think that we begin to see it show up in text, genre texts called Puranas that go back to around the, well, it's very difficult because they don't refer to themselves in relation to things that can be dated. They are more like poetry. They're all kind of, they look in, but certainly by the turn of the millennium, or even further into before the Common Era, 300-400 maybe, and there are lots of variations. I've got about 40 different variations. There's one that I didn't bring in here that when that's attested in a couple of texts anyway, that texts that are especially about the goddess, and Shiva says that he doesn't want to go to the sacrifice, and she says that she wants to go. So you can begin to feel the kind of the tension And so finally he says, well, no, I don't think you should go. And at that point, she expands her persona in such a way that she takes 10 different forms, the so-called Dasha Vidya. And all of these forms are different forms of feminine power. And Shiva is so overwhelmed by this display of her that he says, okay, whatever. So there are moments, even though we think of Sati as being kind of victim of this immolation tradition. In fact, when you get into the interstices of the story, you see that there's a great deal of energy that is coming from her that is transformative, not only of her situation, but I mean, it leads to, it provokes Shiva to, once he's become the sacrificial fire, it provokes him to come and rearrange things for Daksha so that he then becomes beheaded and knows his place in the order of things. So as every father-in-law, every father of daughters must, in one way or another, even if they never think about it, they are undergoing it at some level or another, unless they want to drive their daughter nuts and get in the way of their, which no father-in-law or father should. And most of the time, the son-in-law will. Yes. So, yes.
Yeah. Paul, thank you very much for this. Some of us have had the opportunity to follow your research on Sati along for a number of years. Could you tell us a bit about your journey from the first sort of interest or focus on Sati? I mean, what I remember is these scenes where women of certain men, usually of some kind of renown, where the man has died, and now Sati referred to this ritual fire where the woman then went into a fire to die and go with her husband. Okay. Now, could you tell us about your journey? I mean, did you first start with knowledge about this ceremony, funeral ceremony, and then how did you find this particular story so that it has come now to this point over a number of years?
Well, he's letting out what I hope to conceal, namely, I've been at this a while. And but thank you and it's a good question, because I was thinking of kind of walking you through a little bit of where's all this been going. I started out with it was kind of after I did my first book, and I got interested in the whole colonial situation in which in India that really began in full blast after about the middle of the 18th century, and when the East India Company was slowly evolving from being a trading organization, a very profitable one most of the time, to being a revenue collection agency. And so they began to get authority from the Mughals state to collect revenue on the part of the Mughals, but the Mughal state was so weak and extended at that point that the British collected it and just kind of kept it for themselves. So, then the question was, the more generic question I was asking at that point, what difference did this colonial relationship between India and the West, how did that impact on religion? What kind of religion did people who were coming from Britain, mostly, there were some French and Dutch and some others, but coming from Britain on one hand, and what kind of religion did they find, or did they think they found when they, over the next, half century or so? It's that period from about 1790 to 1830, but there is a kind of beginning and end to the story, I think, at some level, although it obviously goes on, and religion becomes a very important player you might say, in the formation of Indian identity, and particularly political identity. So that the goddess is embedded in a lot of the iconography and political discourse. I mean, in some ways, maybe now more than ever. But so for me, it started out with what was going on, and then I kept finding these references, and the British were kind of in a bind about this because they didn't like the fact that this so-called religious practice was going on, and there was some question in their mind about whether it was a perversion of a, and that was one of the ways that some of the Hindu intellectuals at the time who were in conversation with the British were saying, no, this is not this doesn't have any authority, it doesn't have any legitimacy in our tradition. And so I thought, well, then why did they keep calling it religious? So, the British began to say, well, you can do what you like to the Hindus, you can do what you like as long as it doesn't violate our norms of what they called humanity and reason. And this seemed to be a completely unreasonable thing in which women were being victimized and so on. And there was, and this is something historians have been trying to reconstruct, and with not a lot of success, and that is, how widespread was this practice actually, and who was involved in it. The first one you mentioned, that sometimes kings or who died, particularly in the western part of India, in Rajasthan, in that area, if a local Raja died, then there was a kind of assumption that the wife whose care for him and loyalty to him enabled him to be a good king, that they would go together. And so in that sense, they kind of modeled the sort of the dharma of marriage. So I was kind of working on the colonial context, and then this is when I was at the National Humanities Center. It was before I came here. That's how long I've been at it. And because I've been here ever since the beginning. How accurate is the data that we do have? And the data we do have comes from the East India Company judicial system, and the local district collectors. The British divided Bengal up into various districts, and each had their own judicial system and revenue collection system. So they were in fact building the infrastructure of the colonial state during this period. And so one of the jobs that the collectors were supposed to gather is annual reports of how many of these episodes actually took place. And so they would send their darogas, they're called, they send their Indian, so-called native police officers out to try to get data on this and to prevent it if they could. But if they, more often than not, they got there after it was over. The information you're not dealing with the age of cell phones, so it took a while for word to get around, and oftentimes it was all over before it was even known about. And so, how accurate and reliable is this? It's, I think, an open question. But at any rate, there was a perception by the British and by some Indians as well, that Hindus as well, that this was some kind of deep trauma is going on in this culture as it's undergoing this colonial transformation. There's a well-known political psychologist who's been here to speak a couple of times, Ashish Nandi, who did the kind of first article in which he said, this really is a kind of pathology of the colonial world. And so the way I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but one of the ways I'm trying to argue that is to say, what if you thought about the power that the woman demonstrates by virtue of her willingness to go, apparent willingness, or maybe she's not, maybe she was intoxicated or she was drugged, and there's a lot of allegations to that effect, but whether there is a kind of power that is generative of her by virtue of her being where she is, maybe a woman, a wife who's got a dead husband on her hands. Whether that counts as a kind of capital, as a kind of currency that can be exchanged for status, maybe, for a family. That there's a story that my friend Sue Wadley, who's an anthropologist at Syracuse, she was doing a study of this village in central India, and it was in the hot season, and there was a huge fire that came through and burned a lot of oftentimes they use tree branches and stuff to make pens to keep the animals in. So all this stuff got burned. The animals were killed. Several people died in the fire, and it just, like the fires we saw in California, I mean, it just took out everything. And so about some months or sometime later, she went back and interviewed a lot of people, and she talked with this one woman whose house was spared. And the fire, I mean, this happens apparently with these wildfires, is that the fire burnt the one over here and the one over there, but theirs was fine. And so Sue asked her, this woman, what does she make of that? And she said, oh, in our family, some time back, generations ago, there was a sati in our family. So if you try to connect those dots, then the question is, maybe there was a kind of an investment made by virtue of that action. And that actions can be seen as a kind of exchange of capital. So it kind of opens the metaphors of economics to the study of religion in a way that I hadn't thought about before. So, but then the other thing I was going to say that when I was just beginning to work, I had a proposal enough to at least to get a desk at the National Humanities Center. And it was there about a month. And a young woman named Rup Kanwar allegedly became a sati or was immolated, and people around her community was saying that this was a divine intervention, and people who were less persuaded, which included the media, feminist theorists and cultural critics, that this represented a huge step backward for India's march to modernity. And so it became kind of politicized, and the case went on in the courts for close to 30 years before, and nothing was. I mean, it ran out of gas. There was some arrests made initially by her family, and I had the opportunity to go to that place and see the house where she lived, and it is clearly, as it's saturated with spiritual symbols, and I think for some at least, there was no doubt in their minds that they saw what in maybe another tradition would be called a miracle, whereas others said we have been cursed by this, and we did like a friend and colleague at Columbia, Jack Hawley, and edited a book called The Sati, the Blessing and the Curse, and he asked me to do the opening essay that kind of set the context of how to think about these things. But so one of the challenges we face in the study of religion is what kinds of categories and classifications do these things belong in? What makes this text a sacred text? What makes an event miraculous, where it's the same person standing next to you saying, that's not what I'm seeing going on? So I think that's part of why it takes a while to kind of live with this. And for reasons that you can imagine, it's not a topic that many Hindus or Indians feel comfortable talking about. They feel in a sense exposed, and it's in the same way that probably many of us feel about the legacy of slavery. I mean, we're not proud of this. And yet it happens. I mean, my wife and I were just down in Savannah and went through a house, a historic house that had slave quarters, or what they called enslaved people, and you really felt viscerally the inequality of that world. So I think it's painful. I mean, and so I've thought more than once about, I'm not sure the world needs more books about this, but I think it's also, and this is where other people's myths can illuminate our lives. And since stories and myths aren't property, nobody owns them. They're in a sense available unless they're authored. I mean, I can't, read somebody's novel or something without knowledge. But these are stories that have been around for thousands of years, and in a sense, they belong to all of us. And so, what I hope I'm doing is taking that seriously, and I do it in the awareness that not everybody may be persuaded. That's what I'm doing. But so I hope, yeah.
I'm so delighted to be here. By the way, my name is Uma. I'm not Sati, but I'm Uma.
But she is a form of the goddess, so just so you know.
So that's all. And Dr. Courtright used to be my mentor. He still is. He was one of my PhD advisors also. And I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. Proud to see you here.
Yeah, thank you. Talking about your last point about mythology and the characters of mythology, this is how exactly we grew up. We grew up hearing all these stories without analyzing. So analytical part comes later. When you start yourself to figure out things, why, what did it really happen, what does it mean, etc. So I'm glad that the way you analyze, there are so many perceptions, so many perspectives. I personally was thinking of if this cautionary tale also could be called a sort of satyagraha, standing up for truth. So it's a story of loyalty, and very interestingly, it's not only Parvati or Uma's loyalty to Shiva, but Shiva also is shown as furious and enraged by his wife's insult. So it goes both ways, that both are devoted to each other, both are loyal to each other. But to me, I think particularly the sacrifice, immolation in fire, that reminds me of Buddhists, some of the Buddhists who immolated themselves for making some political or religious point. Similarly, I would say that sati can also be symbolized as, feeling so strongly about your cause that you do not mind sacrificing yourself. So that's how I would interpret one of the myths, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.